So unlike some of the other panels, we're going to actually be focusing on the application of technologies to the administration of elections. Although it's focused more on election administration, we also want to think about those actors like civil society groups and parties who actually try to oversee these technologies, because I think that in addition to applying technologies to administration, applying the knowledge of IT to the oversight of e-voting technologies is actually another critical challenge that we're hoping that some of you in the room can be part of solving. So just a couple of points before we get started. I just wanted to sort of set the stage for the discussion so that we can have a framework in which to pose questions following the presentations. Electronic voting and counting technologies, we've seen them spread around the world over the last several years and even decades in some cases. They're happening in both fully developed democracies, as we might call them, such as the U.S., although even in the U.S., as we'll hear today, there are significant challenges still facing the administration, as well as in many developing countries around the world. And we're going to hear from Ben Goldsmith of IFAS, who I'll introduce later, on some of the new emerging technologies, but also some of the challenges that come into play when we talk about implementing in countries where even manual elections have not necessarily gone well in the past. When we bring technology to the administration of elections, this introduces several challenges that we need to think about, and I think will be part of our discussion today. Some of these challenges relate to ensuring secrecy of the ballot, which is more difficult to do when we're talking about especially internet voting in some cases. Security against fraud, auditability of the results, where you don't have a manual ballot anymore, you have electronic voting of some sort. And cost and sustainability issues as well when you're talking about technology, storing machines, other things that come into play. So these are some of the challenges that we face in the U.S. as well as around the world in implementing electronic voting technologies. They have many benefits too, and we'll hear from our panel about some of the benefits that technologies can bring in solving challenges that election administrators face. But we're fortunate today to have a very diverse panel. We have some of the leading experts both in the U.S. and the world on e-voting technologies. I hope that we're going to have a fruitful discussion. We're going to probably do this as about an 8-minute presentation each, and then we'll hopefully have about 30 minutes or so at the end for a good dialogue. And so think of your questions as you go through the presentations. So first, we're going to have Ben Goldsmith of the International Foundations for Electoral Assistance, IFAS, Electoral Systems, IFAS otherwise known as. He's the country director for the Kosovo program for IFAS. He's actually joining us via video from Kosovo. Ben, actually, I should say, is working with NDI, who I work for, on a guidebook on electronic voting, both implementing and overseeing electronic voting. So Ben is one of the two lead authors on this guidebook. So Ben, we'll let you start off the conversation and take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. I hope you can hear me okay through the link. As you say, IFAS has a long interest in election technology, and we've published a number of different books and reports on different aspects of election technology. And this led to us recently being awarded a contract to assess the recent Norwegian pilot on electronic voting, internet voting actually. And it's part of that review that I wanted to present on this panel today, because one of the topics we were asked to investigate was to provide an overview of the use of electronic voting and internet voting around the world. So I'll present the main results of that shortly. I also want to just briefly introduce the common types of technology that we talk about when we're looking at electronic voting, and then finally wrap up by discussing some of the challenges, some of which you alluded to just now. In terms of the common types of technology, this is not a comprehensive list. There are many different permutations and combinations of technologies, but I'd like to generally classify technologies in terms of voting technologies, the act of marking the ballot, and the counting technologies, counting the actual ballots. So if you're looking at voting technologies, the most common one is the direct recording electronic voting machine. This is your typical voting machine that you would find in a polling station, where you go in, you record your vote on the voting machine, and it presents the results at the end of polling in the polling station. I would also say that the direct recording electronic voting machine combines the marking of the ballot and the counting of the ballot as well. Another key voting technology is remote voting, and the most common one of these is internet voting, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail later. But it's not the only way of voting remotely. It's also possible to vote by telephone, by SMS voting, even by digital television. The UK trialled digital TV voting several years ago. So while internet voting is often the most talked about remote voting technology, it's certainly not the only one available. In terms of counting technologies, these technologies count paper ballots. So the most common ones, again, are optical mark recognition or optical character recognition, where voters will cast a ballot, a paper ballot, and the machine reads how they've marked that ballot and produces the results at the end of polling. And punch card counting machines are also an example of counting technologies, but certainly in the US is a technology which is being used less and less these days. In terms of global experiences of using DREs, electronic voting machines, let me say something on methodology first. Particularly when it comes to internet voting, it was not clear when a country had used a particular technology. And let me give an example. Many countries use internet voting for trade union elections, for student union elections, for local neighborhood elections. But we didn't want to necessarily classify a country as having used internet voting or electronic voting if it used it for that kind of election. So basically, we decided to come up with a categorization system where we would consider a country to have used the technology when they used it for a binding political election, like for a parliament or assembly, or for the position of a president. And the data that I'll present here is accurate as of probably early this year. It's obviously a fairly quickly changing environment, and some countries are moving in and out of these different classifications all the time. So in our review of the use of electronic voting machines around the world, we found 30 countries which had used electronic voting at some point. And on the map that we have here, the dark blue countries, and there are 3 of them, are countries which use electronic voting on a national level for all of their elections. And these countries are Brazil, India, and Venezuela. The light blue countries on the map, and there are 8 of these, use electronic voting in parts of the country, but not all of the country, and for all elections. The light brown countries, and there are 7 of these countries, we classify these as still experimenting with electronic voting machines. So they've been doing pilots, they haven't necessarily reached a conclusion about whether they want to continue and use electronic voting machines on a larger scale. The dark brown countries, and there are 9 of these, are where electronic voting machines have been piloted and discontinued. And there are 3 countries which actually used electronic voting machines and used them for many years in some cases, and then decided not to continue with using electronic voting machines. And on the European map, which is on the next slide, you can see that 2 of those countries are in Europe. They were Germany and Holland. And the 3rd country which had been using electronic voting machines across a number of elections and then moved away from this was Paraguay in South America. In terms of global experience of internet voting, we found 13 countries around the world which had used the internet for binding political elections of some description. Some of the countries are quite small, so it may be difficult to see them on this map, so let me just go through them. There is one country, Estonia, which uses the internet for all of its elections, for local elections, for parliamentary elections, for European elections, and it's not that every voter uses the internet, but it's an option for every voter. They can decide to cast their vote by the internet if they choose to. There are 6 countries which use internet voting in parts of the country or for parts of the electorate. These countries are Australia, the United Arab Emirates, France, Switzerland, Canada, and Mexico. And you find in these countries that internet voting is often used for a niche part of the voting population. So maybe it's used for the overseas voters or people who are away from their polling station on election day, or for people who live a long distance away from a polling station, or maybe have some disability which makes it difficult to actually attend a polling station on election day. There are two countries which we classified as having pilots which were ongoing, and these are India and the US, and I guess we'll hear more about the US experience shortly. There are two countries where internet voting was piloted and not continued, and these are the United Kingdom and Finland. And there are two countries which actually used internet voting in elections on an ongoing basis, and then moved away from using internet voting. And this was Holland, which used it for two parliamentary elections for their overseas voters, and the city of Barcelona in Spain, which used it for a referendum. And in fact, it was the only way of voting in that referendum in Barcelona. But these two countries have moved away from internet voting now. And I think that in looking at this global review of electronic voting experiences, including internet voting, there are a number of challenges that come up and themes that come up in the use of these technologies. And I hope, I can only briefly cover these now, I hope we get a chance to explore them in more detail in the questions. But I think trust is a key issue with electronic voting, whether in a polling station or remotely through internet voting, for example. Because basically the use of machines to cast and count votes is inherently less observable than paper voting. With paper voting, you can see and observe every aspect of the process. And especially internet voting is very difficult to observe properly. Now, I think there are solutions and there are ways around this. When you look at the use of electronic voting machines, one of the principal ways in which we try and overcome this lack of transparency and observability is by creating a voter verifiable paper audit trail, which creates a paper record of the electronic transactions and creates a possibility for counting that paper record and checking that the electronic results are tally with the paper record. But I think with remote voting, this option is obviously not available, and it's much more difficult to achieve this level of transparency, observability, and auditability of the process. Michael, you alluded to the security concerns with electronic voting, and I think that these are very real. And I think we should recognize that paper voting is not a perfect system. There are problems and challenges in using paper voting. And in fact, in some of the countries which have adopted electronic voting, it's been specifically to address the problems that they have with the paper voting process. So while we see that e-voting can eliminate or reduce some electoral fraud, I would have to say it creates the possibility for new kinds of electoral fraud. And I think these issues can be dealt with, but they are an additional challenge. And again, I think auditability of electronic voting systems is critical to ensuring that electronic voting systems deliver the correct results, and we can be sure that they deliver the correct results. I think another issue which comes up is the role of stakeholders. You find that you get new stakeholders involved in the electoral process who weren't necessarily there initially. So you have certification institutions who have to determine whether electronic voting machines act correctly. Existing stakeholders also have new roles to fulfill. Particularly when you're looking at remote voting, observer organizations cannot operate in the same way that they used to. They have to find new ways of monitoring process. So I think this creates a challenge for stakeholders and for oversight of the process. Now, implementing electronic voting of any description is a very, very technical process, and election management bodies rarely do it entirely themselves. They often contract out the delivery of electronic voting systems. And I think we see a tendency in some cases to maybe give too much control of the electoral process to outside bodies like vendors of electronic voting machines or internet voting solutions. And this is often because there's a lack of technical knowledge and experience within election management bodies, but I think it's something that, as election administrators, we need to be very careful about. EMBs have to be in control of the electoral process, and that means they have to be able to have enough technical capacity to oversee the process when others are doing parts of it. Another issue which is more to do with remote voting concerns voter identification and authentication. I mean, as long as you're using electronic voting machines in a polling station, you can still authenticate voters in the same way by looking at their ID card, by checking the list of approved voters for a polling station. But once you take voting outside of that controlled environment of the polling station, identifying voters and authenticating that it's actually that voter who's casting the ballot is a lot more difficult. And I think what you see is in the countries where internet voting and remote voting is implemented successfully, there's a very strong online identification infrastructure, an infrastructure which doesn't exist in every developed democracy, and certainly in my case in the UK, we do not have a national ID card, for example. We don't have an agreed method of identifying voters or citizens online. The countries where they do have this, like Norway, like Estonia, I think it provides the necessary infrastructure to implement remote voting, internet voting, in a much more, in a better manner. I think also when looking at the field of electronic voting, we see that there's a lack of standards. There's a significant body of international standards when it comes to elections and voting. But in many ways, electronic voting, internet voting challenges that body of standards because the standards haven't yet adapted to the different ways in which voting and counting takes place with electronic and internet voting. So I think there's a need for that body of standards to develop and to properly regulate the use of technology in voting and counting. I think the final point I would say is that it's a very dynamic field. There are new technologies coming out all the time. There are new implementations of the same technology. It's a very difficult field in some ways to keep up to date with. And we see new technologies being used quite regularly. And an example I would use is that Venezuela recently implemented a biometric identification system with their electronic voting machines, so that everyone had to scan their fingerprint and match it up against the approved list of voters on that voting machine. And I think we're going to see more of this kind of biometric identification of voters in the future linked to electronic voting. So as I say, this is just a very brief overview, I think, of some of the challenges, and I hope we can explore some of them in a little bit more detail in the questions.
All right. Well, thanks, Ben. We appreciate that. I think that provides a good framework for the discussion, especially looking at it from a global perspective. We want to also now zoom in a little bit more on the U.S. We just had, obviously, elections here. We are in a number of different debates over which technologies to apply to elections here. One of those debates is internet voting. And we have Doug Chapin actually to speak to this debate. Doug leads the Election Academy at the Center for Study of Politics and Governance at the Humphrey School for Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Got that right?
That's a long name.
Phrase. Yep. And I think I'll turn it over to Doug now. Just to remind you, I'm not giving a lot of details on bios. Bios are available online and in your materials, so I hope I'm not offending anyone, but we're sort of cutting the chase and getting to the discussion. So, Doug, take it away.
I appreciate that, and actually, given the credentials of this panel, I'm delighted that he's not going into details because it will make me look bad by comparison. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I do feel like I know the television show Sesame Street has been in the news a lot lately, and I do feel a little bit like I'm the one thing that is not like the others up here. We have an international expert. We have my friend and colleague, Mike Alvarez from Caltech. We have Dan Nolan from one of the world's leading vendors. I am here as someone who works with and thinks about the men and women who run elections in the United States. And we are on the cusp, as Ben suggested, and you'll hear more about from other members of the panel, on the cusp of a pretty fierce renewal of the debate about internet voting in the United States. Just 60-second background: the United States have considered ways to bring internet voting into wider application. You've seen some political parties, including Arizona, try it early in the 2000s. You saw the federal government launch and talk about pilots for internet voting for military and overseas voters, and I know the other panelists will probably talk about that as well. But in many ways, that debate fizzled out over concerns about security and transparency and auditability of the ballots cast by voters, whether in their home jurisdictions or around the world. And because of that debate, one of my favorite sayings about internet voting in the United States is that everyone agrees that we will have internet voting in the United States someday. The fight starts, the hard feelings rise, the sharp elbows come out when you try to define what someday is. And I really thought after I hesitate to call it a failure, but the retreat from internet or remote voting in the mid-2000s, that we would likely not see a renewal of that debate for quite a while. But it would appear now, in the wake of the 2012 election cycle, that we are on the cusp of renewing that debate at, if possible, even higher decibels than we did before. And I think really there are three reasons for that. Number one, which is really way below the surface and probably only election officials think about, is that we are in the middle of what I might even call a crisis in the voting technology industry in the United States. We have a market that doesn't work terribly well. We have little to no federal funding available, certainly no state or local money available. We have a federal agency, the Election Assistance Commission, which, if it is alive at all, is on life support and may have its plug pulled by Congress as soon as January. So you have states and localities owning, maintaining, and working with voting technology that they're very nervous about, and in many ways doesn't fit what they want to do with their election administration process. You have jurisdictions that want to move to vote centers, that want to move to a decoupling of neighborhood polling places and the voting process, and they don't have technology necessarily that works for them. And so many places are at already the end of the useful life of the technology that they're using for voting before and on election day. And so they're open to something new if that something new can be approved and work well. The second reason that we're about to have a debate about internet voting in this country is something called the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act of 2009, or the MOVE Act. The MOVE Act was an amendment to UOCAVA. I can never remember what that is. Hopefully Dan will, or someone else. It's the Uniformed Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act or something like, but UOCAVA, I nailed it. So UOCAVA makes it possible for military voters and their families, as well as overseas Americans, to cast their ballots in state and local elections for federal office and often for state office. And the MOVE Act, pushed by my team and I and others at Pew at the time, was intended to help states do a better job of helping those UOCAVA voters do just that. As a result of the MOVE Act and some of the focus on military and overseas voters, you're starting to see more and more jurisdictions, starting with places like West Virginia, but others, thinking very seriously about whether or not to use internet or some form of remote voting for their military and overseas voters. I know that that Mike and some others have been studying pilots in Florida and elsewhere of similar projects, and I imagine he'll talk some about that today. The third reason, and this really is kind of ripped from the headlines, is Hurricane Sandy. Hurricane Sandy, those of us who are election geeks, who care about the election process in the United States, have often talked about the federal government's lack of response or responsiveness to the prospect of an election day disaster. And Hurricane Sandy is the closest we've come to an election day disaster in recent memory. As a result, many jurisdictions, especially states like New York and New Jersey, had to scramble to come up with contingency plans for their voters to cast ballots in time to have them count in the 2012 election. You saw almost literal battlefield surgery with things like email voting, with election officials putting out their Hotmail addresses for voters to request and return electronic ballots. And in the wake of that, I think you're seeing many jurisdictions thinking about the possibility of using internet voting or something like it as a way to assist voters in the event of the kind of calamity that we saw with Hurricane Sandy. So because of those three pressures, fear about the market, interest in assisting military and overseas voters, and a desire to be responsive to both man-made and natural disasters, you're seeing interest in a renewal of the internet voting debate across the country. I will tell you that the people who forced a retreat on the first effort in internet voting are already girding for battle again. There are technologists, there's some election officials and others across the country who may be suspicious of things like direct recording electronic machines, but are almost apoplectic at the notion of internet voting becoming a solution to one or more of the problems that I've just described. For that reason, I would not be surprised if we don't see a renewal and intensification of the kind of debates we had in the mid-2000s about things like verifiability, auditability, transparency, security, and the like when it comes to internet voting in this country. I do know, hearing from election officials and policymakers across the country, that state legislators and some federal legislators seem to be intrigued, if not outright interested, in the prospect of internet voting. I don't know whether or not someday is around the corner in terms of implementation of internet voting in this country, but I think it's pretty clear that someday is here when it comes to the renewal of the debate about whether or not the United States will commit to internet voting, and if so, for which voters, and if so, how to do that in a way that meets the concerns and needs of election officials and advocates alike. It's an honor to be here. I appreciate it. I'll look forward to questions, and I will now turn you over to the real experts on the panel. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Doug. We appreciate that. Now, I'd like to turn it over to kind of flip to the other side of the coin here. To look at the oversight or assessment of electronic voting technologies. And we have a great person here to do that, one of the ideal people actually to do that, Michael Alvarez, who's a professor of political science at Caltech. He's also the co-director of the Caltech MIT Voter Technology Project. He's got some interesting discussions to provide for you on looking at U.S. Elections and technologies applied in them. So I'll turn it over
thanks.
to you, Michael.
I'm actually going to stand because I like to move around. So, just like Doug said, I'm really glad to be here, and it's an interesting panel, and I look forward to your questions. It's just fascinating for me to hear Doug talk about internet voting, and I'll try probably to avoid it as much as possible here, because Doug's already talked about it, and I think Dan's going to talk about it a little bit. We'll certainly talk about it more in the questions and answers, because I've been studying internet voting since 1998. And I was just sitting here thinking, I know I have some gray hairs, but when I think back to studying internet voting for 14 years, it makes me feel really old. But I'll talk, a little bit more about those experiences, let's see, as we move forward. What I want to talk mainly about is the Voting Technology Project, and just give you some overview of some of the recent work that we've done. Much of it, of course, is associated with electronic voting. And we started this project back in 2000. In the wake of the 2000 presidential election in Florida. At that time, I had actually, again, been studying voting technology issues just sort of on the side, because internet voting had come up in California in 1998. And I was on a task force that our then Secretary of State Bill Jones put together with a number of just very illustrious people who've stayed involved in the debate about internet voting since then. And we studied that Arizona primary. My colleague Thad Hall and I studied some of these pilot projects. And again, it's one of these gray hair moments where I realized that Thad and I wrote a book called Point, Click, and Vote, which is about internet voting, which was published in 2004. Amazing. And I think we predicted in that book that we would eventually see internet voting in the United States. But like Doug said, someday. Yeah. But in any case, I was sort of already studying these issues. The Florida election hit. And the president of Caltech, David Baltimore, Nobel Prize-winning biologist, and the president of MIT, Chuck Vest, who's a world-renowned engineer, literally called each other on the phone a few days after the election and said, these problems that we're seeing in Florida, these are things that Caltech and MIT can fix. And of course, they then call some of their faculty and say, well, you guys got to figure out how to fix this. And so they put our group together. It was a group of, really interesting group of political scientists, economists, computer scientists, information technology experts, usability folks, and this bi-coastal partnership began. And since 2000, we've produced many, many reports. This is the cover from the first one that we did in 2001. Our website is votingtechnologyproject.org. Everything you're going to see here is available there in some way, shape, or form. And again, we've continued to do our research since 2000. We've produced over 100 working papers, written many, many books, issued many, many studies, and there's actually kind of an interesting wealth of material that's accumulated from our project over the years. Let's see, point it somewhere. There we go. Okay, so what did we find in 2000? And again, this was the interesting thing. We were tasked with fixing the technology, okay, which technologists are wont to do. But as we surveyed what had happened in 2000, our technologist involved in the project, along with the social scientist, quickly understood that the problems that were seen in Florida were just the tip of the iceberg. Indeed, the vote-o-matic punch card system was a problematic punch card system. It was a problematic voting system because it led to many voters making many avoidable mistakes. But as we looked at the data, we saw also that there were all sorts of other places where there were problems with election administration and voting technologies in the U.S. We estimated that at least 4 to 6 million votes were somehow lost in the presidential election in that year. And I believe there were about 100 million votes cast in the presidential election in 2000. So it gives you some sense for the scale. And yeah, many of those were lost because of bad voting machines, in particular punch card voting machines, which were used in Florida, Texas, California, a variety of very large jurisdictions. But we also found that between 1.5 million and 3 million votes were lost due to voter registration problems with the lists, inaccuracies in the list, people who thought they were on the list and weren't, for example. We also estimated that at least 1 million votes were lost because of polling place problems, which we again saw this past election cycle here in places like Florida, which is leading to some of the calls, as Doug talked about, for reforms and fixes of the process. But due to data limitations, there were many things that we weren't able to look at, especially absentee voting. And absentee voting, as most of you know, many of you may have even voted by absentee in one way, shape, or form in recent years, has many of its own problems, which we talk about in some of our recent research. Recently, we just released a report in late October, and we went back and had this great opportunity to sort of survey the landscape as to what's happened in the U.S. since our 2001 report, and to talk about some additional reforms, lots of places where we think additional improvements are necessary. And again, I think Doug's hit on some of these already, and I'll just reiterate them. The Help America Vote Act was passed in 2002 here in the U.S., and it was very significant federal legislative reform, and many states issued their own reforms, and some localities did as well. There was much that was improved in the wake of the Help America Vote Act, in particular the replacement of many of these inferior voting technologies, especially punch card voting machines. We talk a lot about this in the study that we just did. The federal EAC, which Doug mentioned, was instituted and actually did a fairly large amount of pretty helpful work in the years in which it had fully staffed leadership. One of the most important reforms, and we talk about this also in the report, that has led to sort of unrealized gains. We haven't really been able to measure, I think, some of the important implications of statewide voter registration databases in the U.S. Because they're still, in some sense, being implemented, and election officials are still figuring out how best to use those. All states are now required to use provisional voting. States had to reform and revise and revamp their procedures and requirements for how they educate voters, which we think is a substantial improvement. And again, in the last decade, there's been an enormous growth of research on the academic side. This was an area where when we started looking at elections in late 1998, when I was starting to study internet voting, or in 2000, 2001, there just wasn't a lot of academic attention on the issues of election administration and voting technology. That has changed. And I think that's one of the most important things that has changed in the last decade. Now, of course, that's a bit self-serving, but I still think it's a very important change. There's still a lot of room for improvement. We talk about this in the report that we just issued. And I'm going to hit on a couple of these topics and talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done. Election auditing, very important. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in the United States regarding improvements and implementations of election auditing, and I'll speak to that in a few minutes. Statewide voter registration databases are an incredible improvement in the U.S., but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, in particular to standardize those databases so that they can be used across states. As some of you know, the debates about voter authentication have been very politicized in the U.S., and we talk a bit about that in our report and suggest some ways that the voter authentication and verification process can be improved. We also think that there's a lot of room for how information gets pushed into polling places in the U.S. Where I vote in Los Angeles County, polling places are still using paper. The voter rolls are paper. Many places are experimenting with electronic poll books or the pushing of electronic information into polling places to help poll workers better do their jobs. We also think that there's a lot of room for information to be pushed out of polling places, in particular to alert voters to long lines in poll sites and various other problems that might be going on. We're very cautious about postal voting or mail voting, and I can talk about that in the question and answer time. So I wanted to hit on a couple of areas that I thought might be interesting to the folks here. One of the things that we've been doing a lot of work on is what we call election forensics. I think this is a relatively new area in the academic study of elections, and I think an area where there's a lot of room for academics to help facilitate improvements in election administration and also voting technologies. The photograph here, this is the voting system that's used in Venezuela. And we wrote a paper about this. Again, it's on our website. It was published in 2009. Inez Levine, one of my former graduate students who's a professor at the University of Georgia, was the lead author here. And what these election forensics are all about are just applications of typical statistical models to elections data. And I've just given you a simple demonstration here, a simple graph. One of my colleagues at Caltech, who's a co-author on this paper, Peter Ordashuk, he noticed that when you look at turnout statistics, when you just simply array distributions of turnout, that you typically see that they have a nice normal distribution, the usual bell-shaped curve. Election after election, you look at it, they're all nicely normally distributed. The center may be in different places because of turnout. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower. But when you look across precincts or counties or whatever the unit is, typically they have a nice bell-shaped curve. Well, Peter and some of his colleagues noticed that in instances where, of course, there's allegations of election fraud and when there actually is demonstrated evidence of election fraud, oftentimes you'll see that as deviations from these bell curves. In their example, you see a little bit of an example in this one graph, the slide or the histogram that's far to the right. Oftentimes you'll see these little bumps on the shoulders of these distributions. Here it's a bump. When they looked at the Ukraine in 2003, they not only did they see a bump, they saw a big spike. Sometimes when you look at these distributions, in fact, you will see evidence where some of the precincts will report greater than 100% turnout, which is sort of a bad indication. So in any case, we've done a lot of work on this front, and I can certainly talk more about that if folks are interested. Election auditing. Thad, Lana Atkinson, a professor at the University of New Mexico, and I recently edited this volume of essays on election auditing. In the United States, we have not had a very strong tradition of election auditing. Many states have been moving to improve those procedures. In the book, we talk a lot about this. These procedures range from the typical, which is a post-election ballot audit, where you'll sample ballots after the election, recount them in certain ways to verify the integrity and the accuracy of the count on election day. But as we talk about in the book, there's lots of other things that can be audited. In particular, voter registration files and voter registration databases. In the U.S., we don't do a very good job of auditing those databases. Many other countries do a better job of that. And we talk a lot about how auditing of election administration procedures can be improved. This is a great place where we can have more transparency and more openness in the electoral process, not just in the U.S., but abroad. This book just came out, Evaluating Elections. It came out so recently, I don't even have a copy of it. But it is out. They sent copies to my colleagues, not to myself. But again, Lana Atkinson and Thad and I wrote this book. And it's about how anybody, not just an academic, but in particular election officials and those who are interested in looking at the integrity of elections, how they can take advantage of the wealth of information that's naturally produced about elections to try to see the relative performance of election administrators and election administration, but also how other forms of data can be helpfully used in that process. Surveys of voters, surveys of poll workers, analyses of registration data, all sorts of information can be used, pulled together to try to study the performance of an electoral system and compare it to others. So it's a series of studies of how that can be done. Last, we've done a lot of work actually outside of the U.S., and this is just an example of a project that we have worked on in Salta, Argentina, where they've been implementing a very particular type of electronic voting system there. The paper that's behind this hopefully will be published relatively soon. It's under review right now. But I wanted to just point this out as an example of partnerships that are going on between the research community, in particular academics, and election officials, not just in the U.S. but abroad, where we're working very, very closely these days in a way that we didn't work a decade ago to try to help election officials better assess the types of technologies that might be appropriate for elections and for solving particular types of electoral problems that they have in their jurisdictions. And again, we've done this kind of work in Argentina, in Colombia, in Estonia, and many countries throughout the world. So that said, this is the cover of our most recent project, our project report. We're at votingtechnologyproject.org, and I'm sure we're going to have lots of great questions, so thank you.
All right, thanks, Michael. All right, well, we'll go to our final presentation here, and we'll go back to the other side of the coin, which is the administration or implementation of electronic voting technologies. Luckily, we're here joined by Dan Nolan, who's the Vice President of Strategic Planning and Government Operations at SOE Software at the Cyto company. They actually are one of the service providers that help implement electronic voting here in the U.S. and many countries around the world. So Dan's going to give a little bit of perspective on how electronic voting technologies have been used, not only in the U.S., but some challenges and lessons learned that have happened around the world in their work. So Dan?
Michael, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here today. This is a great conference. And not to self-deprecate my panel members, they are the true experts in this field. I would never claim to any of those titles. However, I was stationed in Germany in the military in 2000 and was a UOKAVA voter, and was rapidly deployed to Kosovo, to Camp Bondsteel, which I'm sure Ben knows well, and had an absentee ballot trying to chase me around a couple of different countries that never got to me. Following that experience in 2000 to 2004, I was the Deputy Supervisor of Election of the fourth largest county in the state of Florida as we went through the transition from paper voting to DREs, as well as establishing the procedures for early voting. So I have a warm place in my heart for all of the transitions that are necessary to do that. But today, let's see, now let's master the technology. Anytime you're ready. I could do this as hand puppets.
I could stand up.
Imagine, if you will. Do we have?
Just bear with us for 1 second.
Not as sorry as I am. Well, I think in the question and answer period, we're going to have a wonderful time discussing what I would have talked to you about. And the intent was to share information on what Cyto has done in the area of internet voting. What I want to be able to give you is an overview, a little overview of what Cyto is, what their process is, and how my company, SOE Software, fits into that mix as their representative here in the U.S. I can talk about sort of the important things we're going to talk about is the conventional and cryptographic methods that are now being employed to enable. He's going to load it now. Oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have read it out loud, should I? 2 minutes. Okay, this will go into my overall count. The challenge we have today is that I feel that maybe the conversation has slowed down on internet voting. There has been such a hue and cry about concerns about security, about adding risk, absolutely essential conversations to have, but we need to continue to have the conversations. And in some case, it's become, if you're talking about the potential for electronic voting, you might as well be talking about kicking puppies. You're not going to be a very popular person in that. Yet the technology has evolved. Capabilities in conventional security systems on our computers at home. Messrs. Norton and McAfee make a fair bundle of making sure that our systems are secure in our personal areas, not to mention what's been done over the last 10 years in reinforcing and hardening computer systems that are responsible for transactions far beyond what we would hope to accomplish in voting. That being said, those transactions may be monetary. They are certainly not surrounding the sanctity of the vote. So if we ever get this loaded, what I would want to do is quickly talk you through the process of how CITL has looked at something.
Well, actually, why don't we do a quick question and while we wait, and then we can turn it over while we wait for the presentation. Yep. Okay.
That's fine.
I think just summing up what we have so far, does anyone have any questions for the first three speakers while we wait? Yep. Go ahead.
Hello. So Doug mentioned, we're on the cusp of this change of someday having e-voting in the U.S., and Mike also mentioned that we need to allow sharing between the states and around statewide registration data. So from a federalism perspective, do you think the momentum will come from local, state, or the federal government so that one day we will see e-voting in any upcoming elections?
Far away.
I will say, given the current state of the U.S. Congress on a number of issues, not the least of which is election administration, I would be deeply skeptical about any federal effort to impose any kind of mandate on internet voting or other kinds of election administration. I think that most of the momentum we're going to get in this field is going to probably come from some combination of state and local election officials. Mike mentioned the need for states to cooperate on voter registration information. We're starting to see that under the auspices of a program that the Pew Center on the States has put together. States are also cooperating on making open data available on voting information. I would guess if this happens at all, it will probably happen at the state level, and then if it does in fact propagate nationally, it will be ripples outward from one or more states rather than some sort of top-down effort from Washington.
Yeah, what he said is right.
Okay. With that, I will cut the debate off for now, for just temporarily, while we go and let Dan finally now give his presentation now that we have it queued up.
Well, I will skip through the first couple of slides in deference to your time. Just very quickly, background in CITL. It has a university background, a university spinoff, more than 30 academic papers published, about 83% penetration of the current market, with 50 out of the 18 countries that are conducting binding elections served. Largest patent portfolio you'll find, 21 patents issued with over 20 pending. And the company has over 200 elections and technology experts throughout the world, from Tampa, Florida, to Barcelona, Spain, to Norway, and on. These are a few of the countries that, these are all the countries that CITL has participated in an election process, either in election management or in actual internet voting. And in the United States, over 1,400 jurisdictions are serviced by products that CITL and SOE software have produced, and they're available in 30 states. I stole this, well, I created this after reading Ben's excellent paper that with his two co-authors they did on out-of-country voting. And it was a way to try to look at what are the ways that one can conduct out-of-country voting against certain parameters, a criteria for ranking. And in this particular area, you have the criteria are cost to the Election Management Bureau, the operational complexity and preparation complexity involved with it, quality of access, and then fraud reduction and assured voter ID and verification, the security aspect of it. The 5 methods that Ben and his co-authors looked at were return voting, where if you want to vote, you have to come back to your home country to conduct the voting. In-person voting, where the country conducting the election goes to the country where the out-of-country folks are and sets up polling places. A subset of that being embassy or consulate voting, where you set that same thing up in the embassies and consulate of the countries that your out-of-country voters live. Normal postal return, ballot return, and then finally internet voting. The matrix in there, based on their writing, I ranked these with 1 being highest and 5 being lowest in terms of goodness. And in this particular matrix, we have no disagreement with Ben and the authors, except in the bottom right-hand corner when I look at internet voting and fraud reduction. At CITL, we believe that the technology exists today to change that from the 5 that they see into the next slide. Oh, wait a minute. You're right. Got to be smarter than the machine you're operating. And so what I want to do is very quickly walk you through that that process and see why we think that the time is very close, so that someday may be closer than we think. CITL's security system is multi-layered. I also happen to have a background as a nuclear weapons officer, so I've done a little work on looking at layered security. And CITL's process looks at everything from the verification and authentication of the voter through requiring digital signatures for the votes to be processed. The probably most important thing in the entire CITL system, the NIC system, is that it is under the control of the Electoral Board. For us, that is sacrosanct. It has to be under the control of the Electoral Board. We cannot have access to the system once it's turned over to them for their operation. So let me take you very quickly through what that picture looks like, and this little cartoon takes you from the voter casting their ballot to the tabulation process and on. NIC's cryptographic protocol is highly secure, completely transparent, and user-friendly to the voter. Our protocols ensure that the entire election is under the control of the election board at all times, safeguarding the system from both external and internal attack. Before the election, voters are provided with a credential which they use to strongly authenticate themselves and access their electronic ballot. In countries where you have a national ID card, Norway has demonstrated, and Estonia has demonstrated how to do that, but there are other less intrusive ways to ensure authentication of voters. Now, after the ballot is cast, the voter is provided a receipt to indicate that the ballot was accepted by the system. The ballots are stored then in a tamper-proof digital ballot box until after the election. My comments to my colleagues at CITL as we discussed tamper-proof, I reminded them of when I was issued my first body armor, and the sergeant who issued to me said, "Sir, you got to keep in mind, this is not bulletproof, it's only bullet resistant." So nothing is really truly proof. And only election key. Now, an election key is developed that can be used to open that digital ballot box. Before the election, that key is broken into pieces, and those pieces are then put on secure cards and provided to the Electoral Board. Once the balloting is completed, and until that time, there is no key that allows you to open those secured ballots. Until the balloting is completed, polls close for that day, then the Electoral Board can come together, reassemble that key, and tabulate the ballots. After the election day poll close, the Electoral Board uses their smart cards to regenerate the original election key and authorize the ballots in a ballot decryption process. And this is the process by which the ballot is removed from its digital privacy envelope, thereby breaking the connection between the voter and the ballot. Then the ballot can finally be tabulated, and this is a process we call mixing. The mixing process mixes and decrypts the ballots, providing the Electoral Board with the tabulated results and a list of voting receipts. The process ensures there is no correlation between the voter and his ballot and guarantees the voter privacy at all time. The voting receipt lists are published, allowing the voter to determine if their ballot was in fact counted. Now, we've had a little bit of experience doing that. We've had experience in the United States, and when we talk about internet voting, we think about it as a continuum. And it's a continuum that goes from electronic ballot delivery, where you receive a ballot electronically, you can then print it out, hand mark it, and we even send you a nice origami envelope, so you have a privacy envelope, a regular envelope, and then return it as you would a regular absentee ballot. The next step we would see would be electronic ballot delivery and return. And then eventually at some point, then a complete internet voting system that provided for electronic marking of a ballot. So we see this as a long-range process. And we've done pilot tests in Florida in 2008 in Okaloosa County. We had voting kiosks set up for Uocava voters, and I'm dying to hear the report. All right. But the Federal Voting Assistance Program is doing a report on that process, and we'll hopefully get some feedback on that. Internationally, the country of Norway has done a number of municipal elections doing full internet voting, and they have their intention is to conduct all their elections in the near future using the internet protocol. France has gone in a big way with this, with conducting two very large elections, one that had about 1.5 million voters involved, and we just recently conducted a citizens consultative election process in Mexico that had over 800 voters, but we're waiting on the data on that. I was asked to talk a little bit about some of the lessons learned. These gentlemen just described all the lessons learned that we've had. Your election's only as good as your voter database. And if you've ever had the pleasure of actually sitting at a terminal and putting in information as an election official as I had, you know where the errors are induced. So that's a big challenge, and until we can get to electronic registration where we can remove some of the errors that occurred through the paper process, that's going to be a challenge for us. It's also important to communicate with the electorate. Until we can establish that level of trust and confidence in the process by excessive communication and making sure people are prepared for this, we'll never get to that internet voting. So it's up to election officials and those involved to continue that dialogue and share their ideas as we do in forums like this. With that, I will stop.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Technically, according to the agenda, we have 10 minutes left before the panel ends, but we're going to make the executive decision that we'll continue the discussion for at least another 10 minutes beyond that. So let's say 20 minutes for now. And I just want to go back to a couple of points to connect earlier panels to this panel. When we talk about electronic technologies, we should also think back to some of the principles that make up what we consider democratic elections, or elections that deserve the trust of the citizens, of the voters. And those go back to the issues of accountability, which we talked about in a manual voting context in the morning, but now we're talking about even more challenges as they relate to electronic technologies. Transparency, again, when we talk about electronic voting technologies, we're creating more challenges to transparency. And then inclusiveness. There's a balance between enfranchising more voters, making it accessible through internet voting and other means, but also making it less accessible as we move towards technologies that may be unfamiliar or less people trust less, especially among certain segments of the population. So we balance these principles as we move forward to the future of technologies and elections. So with that, I'd like to invite questions from the audience. I have a few in my head myself, but I will wait till the end in case we run dry on conversation, but I highly doubt that will be the case. So first we'll go over here. Yep.
So we heard in a previous panel about vote buying, even in the presence of secret ballots. And there's probably a term that insiders have for this, but it's something like, I don't sell my vote, I sell to someone the ability to vote for me. And I wonder if you could comment on how internet voting can protect against my selling whatever it is I use to vote to somebody else.
The process of establishing the identity of the voter is it's called a PKI process, and so a voter is precluded from being able to give up that information because the information is provided to him at the time that he's identified to receive the ballot. So he would have to have multiple people available to be able to get at that data in order to be able to sell that vote.
Ben, you may have something to add on that on the international side.
Sure. I mean, I guess in some ways the short answer is that it's much easier to sell your vote if you're using internet voting. But let me add a caveat to that. And I think it comes down to one of the issues that I raised, which is about voter identification and authentication. So if you take the example of Estonia or Norway, the means of casting your vote is using your online identification. And because this is linked to other government services and banking, it's not the kind of thing that you want to give to someone. If you're just talking about a passcode and a username that's sent out to you by email, then it's very easy to give that to someone and say, okay, you've given me some money, now you can cast this vote. But when you're talking about identification mechanisms which allow access to many other services and facilities, then I think voters are a lot less willing to sell those credentials in the same sort of way.
Okay. All right, thanks. Let's take the next question. Yeah, right over here.
I actually have two slightly different questions, and I'll keep them brief. My name's Eric Herron. I'm at the University of Kansas. I do work on elections, especially in Eastern Europe, and was recently in Ukraine, where webcams were installed in polling stations to increase transparency. That was the official reason. Several of my colleagues were concerned about the expense and that it would perhaps have been better to spend the money on vote counting technology that would have changed the process from paper ballots with hand counting to something else. And they asked me what system would be best. So I want to turn the question to you. What would you need to know about an electoral process somewhere else in the world to make a recommendation on the best vote counting process for them to use if they wanted to move from paper ballots to some kind of electronic system? That's the first question. The second question is specifically about internet voting. I have a colleague who does work in cybersecurity, and he told me that advances in quantum computing may render our current encryption not very secure. And how do you keep ahead of advances in computing to maintain the security of the vote, especially with internet voting, but with electronic voting generally?
I think that's me.
Want to take the first question?
The first question is full understanding what the election laws of a particular jurisdiction, country is to be able to address that. And then it's about talking to the election official laws. What are their concerns in the particular region? Are you concerned about voter coercion? Are you concerned about denial of service attacks? So it's understanding what all those potential threats are. And one of those things that I would always tell people is that if you are doing things on the internet, you have to anticipate that you will have things like denial of service attacks. It's going to happen. And so you have to prepare accordingly. But it's working through that sort of threat matrix and then designing mitigating techniques and say, now, given those things you just described, mitigating techniques, what's the best thing to do? If you are in a place where one of those things are intermittent electricity, internet voting is probably not the best thing you can do. Or if there's challenge in the communication system, internet voting is not the sort of thing you need to do. It almost comes to a level of sophistication. So I think that's the sort of conversation you have to, and it has to be a consultative engagement with the election officials, because nobody knows it as well as they will. So until you know those things, you can't really respond. In terms of improvements in attack methods, in cryptography, the folks in Untitled and Jordy Pugliacci, I'm going to get his name wrong, who's the head of our CIO, probably understands this area as well as anybody in the world, and it's a continuous research and development effort within the company to stay out ahead of those things. And so when quantum computing becomes a reality, we ought to have a quantum computing solution to provide for greater security for the system. So it's a continual process. As somebody said earlier today, you're only going to fool people once. You've got to be ready to anticipate what's next and be prepared for that.
I'm not a cryptographer, so I'll leave cryptography aside. But the first part of your question was specifically about ballot counting and tabulation. And, in our experience, and I think this is really what Dan said, so it's going to be sort of echoing Dan's response, a lot of what type of technology you want to recommend evaluating or proposing or studying has to do with the problems that are being experienced in the particular application. You go back to 2000 in the U.S., the problem that we saw was reliability and accuracy. And so that's why we moved very quickly away from punch card voting machines to voting systems that allowed for relatively easy voter verification and for voters to be able to fix the mistakes that they make. Now, in other countries that we've studied, in particular in Latin America, the issues haven't been so much with voter mistakes. They've been more with trying to prevent or mitigate certain types of security problems. And those have suggested certain types of electronic voting systems, like the one that's been experimented with in Salta, where the voter's given a pre-printed ballot. The machine simply marks the ballot for them. It comes out marked, and they deposit that in a ballot box. But the machine's also recording the ballot so that they have a very quick and rapid means of tabulating the votes electronically. But they also have that paper trail that can be independently audited. It can be independently recounted, and so on and so forth. So again, I think it depends, as Dan said, a lot on what problems are being experienced and how the technology can help mitigate or resolve some of those problems.
And I similarly, I'm going to duck the cryptography question, but I want to echo something that Mike said, and especially partially plug his book. I think one of the new buzzwords in the field is auditability. We have in the past in this country tended to build a fence around the cliff to try and keep bad machines from getting onto the market in the first place. But then once they do, we have no idea what happens. And increasingly you're seeing, not just in the technology community, but also in the election administration community, increasing interest in auditability. So whether or not you are using optical scan ballots, internet voting, marbles in a jar, anything that is auditable after the fact so that we can go back and make sure that the result we got is what the machine says we should have gotten based on the tokens we have is incredibly important. I tend to describe myself as a militant moderate on these issues, that I will defend to the death the right to say it depends. So we may see, I have no problem with different jurisdictions using different technology as long as they meet basic standards, and increasingly I think auditability is going to be one of them. One really interesting point that I want to make, now I don't know if it's even relevant here, but I want to make it, we saw a lot of this on Election Day. In places where voters, American voters, had a choice between paper-based optical scan ballots and DREs, many voters who had already stood in line for up to an hour just to be validated to cast a ballot were willing to stand in another line to cast a ballot on a DRE, even though voting stations for paper ballots were available. That suggests to me that voters aren't hearing technologists' concerns about DREs, but just as importantly, I think it means that technologists aren't hearing voters' desires with regard to whatever it is they feel like DREs are giving them. So one of the things that we're going to have to battle out in this debate, not just about internet voting, but about technology generally, is whether or not voters and technologists are listening to one another. And all I know is that election officials, like Dan used to be, are the ones catching the grenades in the days before, during, and after Election Day.
Okay. I think Ben may have something to chime in as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's the first question is an issue that we get asked a lot. I mean, we advise the election commissions around the world in many different electoral environments, and many of them are expressing an interest in electronic voting technologies. So we have some experience in this area, and we actually published a guide recently on conducting feasibility studies into using electronic voting and counting technology. And I would agree with what the panelists have said as well. I think it's an incredibly complex decision for an election management body to take. And I think you obviously have to do a full assessment of the existing system, what the strengths and weaknesses are, see what the benefits of that technology might be. Cost obviously plays a significant role in deciding whether it's right for the country. The institutional capacity of the election management body is also another very important issue from an IT perspective, but also from a change management. Using these technologies represents a massive change in the way that elections are conducted. And that goes to the entire electoral organization. And some election management bodies are not really in a position to manage that kind of change effectively. The legal framework, again, needs to be looked at, and we've seen an example in Germany where the use of their voting machines was seen to be contrary to the constitution because of the way that they'd implemented their voting machines. So it's important to take all of these issues into consideration. And I think I would also say that it's very important to not take this decision and do this assessment in isolation, that you need to do a very comprehensive consultation process with all electoral stakeholders to see what their opinions on these issues are. And then I would say, once you've done that, and that's a significant study in itself, you have to test it, you have to pilot it, because you'll make many, many assumptions in trying to consider technology. And sometimes those assumptions are just plain wrong. And once you implement it, once you try it, you realize that those assumptions are incorrect, and you need to reevaluate your decision.
Thanks, and I'll plug IFAS's book actually that they put out a couple years ago on understanding electronic technologies and conducting feasibility studies, and a lot of the things Ben just talked about are highlighted in detail in that book as well. I also noted you raised the issue of web cameras and used in Ukraine. We've seen those used in Russia, Azerbaijan, countries in which have not necessarily conducted elections that are up to democratic standards according to international observers. Not very relevant for this topic, but maybe during the break, if anybody's interested in talking about that issue, I'd love to have a side conversation about some of the concerns and challenges on that front. We do have time for one more question, probably a brief question if possible. Let's take, yep, you sir, right there.
Hi. Do you see, short of internet voting, developments in election technology that might transform the polling place? Maybe, you mentioned the long lines. We all heard about long lines in this most recent election. And maybe making that polling place a little different, a little closer, a little more accessible. I mean, many of us, we can do a lot of stuff when we go to the grocery store. We have to go and buy food, and we can rent a video, and we can do dry cleaning and in bank and lots of other stuff. Is there an opportunity for that to shorten those lines? And also, can that affect maybe the early voting, spreading that out longer, making elections into a bigger event, longer-term event?
Well, I think that goes all the way back to my first point about the state of the market right now. We have a technology market which is has been weakened by acquisitions and companies leaving the field, and we've got a federal certification process that doesn't work terribly well. Unfortunately, many states have essentially lashed themselves to the federal mast and say that they're not allowed to buy machines unless they've been certified by the federal government. And so you were starting to see election officials, including not very far from Mike out in Los Angeles, California, Dean Logan, looking at alternatives to the current model of identifying, procuring, and maintaining election machines precisely to do the kinds of things you described, that as the act of voting evolves away from what I call the Norman Rockwell polling place and the local community hall or school or church to something like a vote center or anywhere voting, all the different names that we have, can we get technology that does all the things that technology should do, be auditable, be secure, be transparent, but also be flexible enough to let election officials and their voters interact with one another in different ways. That doesn't really exist in many, if any, places right now, but there is an interest in, if not an outright effort across the country to see that happen someday.
Anyone else? Okay. Ben, anything else on that? No? All right. Well, let's conclude the panel here. Unfortunately, I think we could talk about this a lot longer. I know from personally, there were about 5 or 6 other topics on this I would have loved for all these experts to have dug into, but that's what the online discussion is for. We encourage you all to go to Tech at State website and sort of continue this conversation online. I believe, obviously, if you're interested in getting anybody's contact information, you can go to the website or come up and approach us afterwards so we can continue the dialogue. Thanks to the State Department, again, for organizing Tech at State. And I think you'll at least get a few minutes break, maybe 15 minutes break or 20 minutes break now before the next set of panels start up. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, panelists.